are doing a Grace and Gavel 2-part live. The first part is she walked away from the crash and then vanished into thin air. Part 2 is when a confession isn't enough to convict someone. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Buffy. I'm an almost 18-year criminal defense attorney. I have a podcast called Grace and Gavel, where truth meets compassion. I'm an almost 18-year criminal defense attorney, and this is my podcast on YouTube. The second one is Recovering Perfectionist Mama, Grace in Progress, and that is a psychology channel. So I have two separate podcasts under the same username, Recovering_Perfectionist_Mama. So one moment, witnesses saw her standing beside the vehicle. The next, she was simply gone. No confirmed sightings, no body, no explanation. And decades later, people still argue about what actually happened. So essentially, the deal is there was a crash scene overview, right? Essentially, she had gotten into a head-on collision with someone and there were actually witnesses there. And so some said that her behavior seemed off. Some said that her behavior seemed off. She seemed disoriented, potentially from the head-on collision. And there were witness observations that confirmed that, as well as emotional distress indicators. Additionally, she also had a appointment for a counseling session that she was supposed to have the next day. However, she never showed up. Additionally, the weather and the environmental conditions could have played a potential factor in that. There are a lot of timeline inconsistencies. And so oftentimes abandoned vehicle cases disturb people psychologically because there is the idea that 1 minute you're in your vehicle, you're safe, you have something happen that interrupts that, and then there's a very short window in which the person disappears. And the thing that's different about Patricia Meehan is the fact that she had witnesses there, and no one can say for certain where she went. And so people assume that if you're in your vehicle that you're going to be safe, right? Vehicles are fun. Vehicles help us get from point A to point B, to go on vacation with our families, to spend time with friends, to do any number of things, jamming to music, and they should be lighthearted and fun adventures, not disappearances. So that's why people oftentimes are psychologically disturbed by that. As well as there's oftentimes disorientation after crashes. I personally have been involved in a car accident in which I was extremely stressed because I was afraid of the consequences of the car accident, even though it wasn't my fault. For instance, I wanted to know whether or not I had the yield sign or whether I had a stop sign. And I remember going back and forth checking to make sure that I didn't have a stop sign, and I would keep checking it and checking it and checking it. And I ultimately was put in an ambulance and taken to the hospital because I was very, very stressed. And so car accidents can be a stressful situation, and there can be lingering effects from it, such as disorientation, such as anxiety, such as all sorts of things, and pain levels and things like that. And so there's a possibility of voluntary flight. Maybe she thought she was going to potentially get in trouble. Maybe there was something she was concerned about, versus foul play. And so ultimately, there's nothing that has indicated one way or the other, which makes this case a psychological mystery that continues even after decades. And then there's exposure risks. I mean, she was in Wyoming, as well as search failures, given the fact of the terrain and things like that. And missing person assumptions can become dangerous. They keep people from focusing on what's actually going on. You know, internet sleuths can be helpful, but they can also be harmful. So like media outlets can also be helpful, but they can also be harmful as well. And so missing a person assumptions can become dangerous, assuming that she went off and lived to live another life, you know, assuming that she decided to just walk away on her own and move somewhere else and start over. Again, none of that can necessarily be confirmed or denied. So we're in that limbo stage. Additionally, there's always the small town rumor dynamics. And there's also law enforcement limitations at the time too. So the most terrifying disappearances often begin with ordinary moments. And I think that's the thing that scares us most of all. And what if the most important clue lasted less than 60 seconds? And that was the fact that she was right there, and then you turn your head and she's gone. And multiple people saw her, but no one knows where she went. Witnesses saw confusion, but how did they miss fear? But did they miss fear? Part 2, when a confession isn't enough to convict someone, and this is actually a common concept. So most people believe if someone confesses, the case is over. Legally, that is not true. And some of the most controversial criminal cases in America happen because confessions alone are dangerous evidence. So it is called corpus delicti, and that means that a confession alone cannot convict someone. There needs to be corroborating or evidence that supports the confession, true facts, things like that. If you think about like Henry Lucas, and I can't remember the gentleman, Otis Toole, I believe, who went around confessing to like hundreds and maybe even thousands of crimes, saying that they committed them because they likely wanted better treatment, like going to better prisons, and maybe being moved to different locations. They also felt like celebrities. They had a lot of steak dinners and things like that because a lot of law enforcement agents thought that that would be a way to close their cases. But if you close a false case, you haven't really closed a case. You've just pushed it down the line for someone else to deal with and for a family to potentially not get closure, which I think is extremely sad, extremely frustrating. And so some of the most controversial cases in America happen because confessions alone are dangerous evidence, right? So we talk about the corpus delicti doctrine. Also, there's a lot of people who, for mental illness issues or other motives, decide to falsely confess to crimes, which again prevents the family from getting closure and actually getting real information on what happened to their loved one, maybe so that they can actually bring their loved one home, which is extremely difficult. Also, prior to the 60s, there were a lot of invasive physical altercations with defendants, such as them getting beat up, them getting harmed, them being pressured into making confessions, often against their will. There was a lot of talk about, torture things or mechanisms to try to coerce them into testifying, generally in larger areas. And that's when the Miranda doctrine came in around the 60s. And as you know, you've likely heard it on true crime shows. You've likely heard it on TV shows if you're into sitcoms who deal with law enforcement and things like that, as well as like Law and Order and things like that as well. So you have a right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. If you choose to, you can retain an attorney. All of those things is the Miranda doctrine. And oftentimes you cannot interrogate someone until they waive their Miranda rights. And ultimately, our system is built on you do not have to self-incriminate yourself, which is the Fifth Amendment. And so sometimes mentally exhausted people confess because they've been there for a long time. Maybe they haven't gotten drinks. Maybe they haven't been able to maybe eat or something like that. And they've been there maybe 20 hours or so, hoping that it'll go away. A lot of times people have the false assumption that they can say, they're thinking that if they confess, then they can go home, which generally is not how it happens. The other thing too is there are times where the law enforcement can actually lie to you and to try to get you to confess, not in like it almost seems like it's counterintuitive, but they can actually say, oh, we actually have somebody who saw you do this crime and they are actually out in the office, or they are actually out in the lobby waiting to identify you in a lineup. Now, that may or may not be true, but officers do have the ability to actually say something like that, even though it's not true. And so their idea is that if you think that someone actually saw you commit this crime, that you're more likely to confess. And that is something that they can actually get you with. And so ultimately, we got to think about how people would react under stress like that. I mean, it has to be extremely exhausting. Juveniles and vulnerable suspects are extremely important. And by vulnerable, I mean people who have a lower intelligence level, people who are essentially more immature for their age and such, could be more susceptible to things like that. That's why generally juveniles are able to have their parents present during some of those questioning. Although, depending on the parents' legal knowledge and understanding, may not be much more help than you would think. And then, honestly, real examples of this can definitely be difficult, because there are certain things that are told to people and people believe them, and there are officers who always push the limit a little bit. There are sometimes officers who push the limit on violence and things like that. However, we are starting to crack down on things like that. There's also evidence that sometimes keeping people sleep deprived can also make them quicker to confess, which again, probably should not be done. And so there's also the idea corroborating evidence matters, because corroborating evidence means that this person knows something about the potential crime, right? But then the issue becomes, have they heard that from someone else? Have they learned it from the newspaper? Like, how did they learn that? Or is it actually their knowledge, or is it actually hearsay that they've heard from other people? And so jury psychology is really important, because ultimately the jury has a lot of trust for law enforcement. And so there is a belief that law enforcement is upstanding citizens, and that, shut the door, Roman, carefully, and that if law enforcement is actually charging this person with this crime, they must have done it. There's also the idea, when you have a criminal defendant, that that person should not be in an orange jumpsuit, that they should actually have regular clothing, so that it does not give the indication that they're guilty or that they've been convicted of something. And there are certain safeguards that are put in place with the trial, who try to protect the defendant and give them an ability to have a fair trial, which is extremely important, and it is the cornerstone of our system. And so oftentimes jurors look at different things in different ways, just because they don't fully understand, because likely they're not legal professionals. And there's a lot of prosecutorial pressure to get a guilty verdict, because they believe that this person is guilty, or that this person, has committed this crime, and that they may potentially create more crimes. And so, for instance, when I was a law student in law school, I had actually chosen, I had done my first trial, and I chose a jury. And what I didn't realize at the time, which the judge graciously shared this with me, was that I had picked a jury, and on the jury was a woman whose boyfriend was due to be before that same judge the next day. And so that woman, in her jury selection, became the foreperson. And the foreperson is generally the person who kind of is the leader. So she was telling them all about her boyfriend's case, and she was telling them about how the state, tends to falsely convict people and all these things, and to bring the man down and all these things, and was saying about how the police had done all of these things to her boyfriend. And so what I learned from that case is, if you are going to have a jury foreperson, make sure the jury foreperson is at least open to hearing what you have to say. Because if they don't, they could literally lead to a runaway jury based on influencing the jury. And they were able to influence the jury because they were part of the jury. And so when the judge told me that, I was kind of blown away. He was like, but I decided to share it with you because I think it was extremely important. He's like, lesson learned, and I've never forgotten that. And so ultimately, there's a lot of public misconception around confessions. People assume that you confess, that's it. But that's not always it. Think about all the people that falsely confess. And those of us who don't understand why you would falsely confess to a crime that you didn't commit, likely you don't have mental illness, likely you're not looking for attention, likely you're not looking to move to another prison that is better and has better food and is closer to your family or things like that. And there is a confession culture in true crime media where a lot of people want notoriety. A lot of people want attention. A lot of people have mental illness, so it's natural to them. And so defense attorneys are going to challenge confession only cases, especially if they're being fed information, which can happen sometimes. It's kind of hard to prove, but it can probably be proven given certain circumstances. And so corpus delicti is extremely important, and it is a cornerstone of making sure that people are really confessing to what they know and what actually occurred. So a confession may sound powerful, but legally it has weaknesses. People assume innocent people never confess. History says otherwise. And the legal system requires more than emotion. Thank you for tuning in to Grace and Gavel, where truth meets compassion. My name is Buffy, and I'm an almost 18-year criminal defense attorney. And I just want to say thank you for tuning in. If you got value from this, please feel free to like and subscribe. I'd greatly appreciate it. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.